We ready to do this thing?
Yes, let's do it. Feels a bit strange for me to be in front of a microphone and not just sitting and watching you in front of the microphone.
Yeah, finally you get to know how it feels.
Okay, well, shall we get into questions?
Yeah, or do you want me to do the intro first?
Yeah, I think let's try that.
Hi there, I'm Michael Bachelard, the host of Trial by Water. And since releasing the podcast, we've had a lot of people contact us. Some have wanted to ask us questions, some have given us feedback, we've had positive and negative, and others have wanted to tell us their stories. And the evidence in this case is kind of so broad-ranging that we couldn't touch on everything in the series itself. It would have gone forever. But there are themes to some of the questions and the comments we've been getting. So we thought we'd address the things, I guess, that have come up most. And to do that, we're doing this bonus episode. It's our first bonus episode, probably won't be our last. So I'm here in the studio with my producer, Ruby. Let's get going.
So the question that we definitely got asked the most in the last couple of weeks since we released the final episode of the podcast was about the state of Robert Farquharson's car when it was pulled from the dam. So basically when his car was fished out of the water, police found that the lights, ignition and car heater, they were all in the off position. And that made police really suspicious at the time. And a lot of listeners who have written to us feel the same way. So can you first just talk a bit about the state of Robert Farquharson's car and why people think it points towards his guilt?
Yeah, so opinion seems to be pretty split on this. Some people think it's the thing that kind of points to his guilt, and others think, well, it's completely irrelevant. So that's kind of one of the reasons we didn't go into it. But let's explain it. So when the car was taken out of the dam that night, what the police found was that the headlights were switched off, that the ignition was switched off, and that the fan on the car's heater had been switched to zero. And you might recall that the reason Robert Farquharson said he started coughing was that he turned the heater fan on. So all of these things to police, particularly police on the scene initially, seemed to be pointing to the fact perhaps that he was lying or that there'd been some reason why he'd wanted those things to have happened. Senior Sergeant Jeffrey Smith, who was the acting head of the Major Collision Investigation Unit and in charge of the scene at the night, he wrote in his notebook, "Not happy with this job, a number of troubling aspects, such as lack of skid marks, instruments in off positions." So from the very beginning of the police investigation, this was something that they took to be suspicious.
I thought it was very unusual that a person would, in the dark, have a coughing fit, drive out onto a dam and turn the ignition key off. And of course the headlight switch was turned off.
Jeffrey Exton, who was another officer at the scene, told a documentary crew a bit later that
the gear shift wasn't in the overdrive position, it was in the direct drive position. And it was a cool, cold night and the fan wasn't turned on. So for a person that was having a coughing fit, had had a cold, not to have the heater on, I thought was really strange too. So a lot of factors in the car.
So those suspicions are starting very early, and there are a few reasons why people were suspicious about this, I think. One was that they thought that perhaps he was trying to make the car harder to find by having the headlights off. Like if the headlights were on, would it have been easier to find at the bottom of the dam? Other people wondered if he had the time and the presence of mind to switch these things off, then didn't he have the time and mental capacity to at least make an effort to rescue the boys? And of course, there was the car heater. Farquharson thought he might have started coughing when he turned it on. Well, that was switched off too. And at the trial, these facts were used pretty heavily against him. So in the first trial, the prosecutor, Jeremy Rapke, in 2007, he says, "When you and your family are drowning, you might think that the condition of the ignition switch and the headlights will be the last thing you'd have on your mind." As if, of course, he's kind of conscious, deliberate and, acting consciously here. And in 2010, at the second trial, the prosecutor, Andrew Tinney, said sarcastically, "So what do you do when you're floating in a dam?" Well, of course, you turn off the ignition and you turn off the headlights, and with them the dashboard lights, because the last thing you'd want out there in the middle of this dark dam is any light. And so when it comes to the Court of Appeal, the judges there say also that these facts are relevant to the critical issue of the applicant's intent, although they don't really spell out why it's so critical.
Yeah. And I guess it kind of makes me think as well about the fact that Farquharson said, it went down like so quickly. It's like those 3 kind of finger snaps. And then to have been able to kind of turn those things off does kind of sound suspicious. But so was Farquharson asked about this? What did he say about it?
So, yeah, he was asked about it in his police interview, and like a lot of other things in that kind of period of time, he says he doesn't know, he doesn't remember, and he kind of speculated that maybe the headlights had got bumped. He said at one point that Jay, his oldest son, who was in the front seat, was capable of switching the ignition off. And in a taped phone call, he speculated that perhaps he'd been worried there was a fire and had turned the ignition off. And this again kind of, well, here's another story that we're hearing for the first time. To me, that just sounds like, well, I'm trying to explain something to myself. So I'm kind of speculating it.
So you've been looking into this quite a bit, and you've actually found what I think is a very interesting case study that might help explain what happened with Farquharson, or at least it kind of shows, that Farquharson isn't totally alone in having done something like this. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, right. So about 18 months after Farquharson drives into the dam, there's a training exercise at a place called Swan Island, which is to the south of Victoria in Port Phillip Bay, and it's a military training camp. And there's a training exercise for senior experienced soldiers of the SAS. Mm-hmm. So these guys are in their 30s. They are the fittest, strongest, etc. guys that you can come across, right? So on the last night of the training exercise, they go off to the pub in Queenscliff, and on the way back, they've all had a few drinks and they're speeding. And they're in 2 cars. So there's 3 in the front car and 2 in the back car. And the 3 in the front car overshoot a curve and go into the water. The water they go into is about 2 metres deep. So it's not nearly as deep as the Farquharson water, but it's deep enough to cover the car. And they try to get out. In fact, there's evidence that there's a boot print next to the door handle, and the door handle's been ripped off. So
wow.
they're really trying to get out. The 2 guys in the car behind them stop, they jump in, they try and get their friends out. They end up actually smashing the back window with a rock. But all of this is to no avail. The 3 in the front car drown. They die. And when they pull the car out, they find that the gear stick was in the park position and the handbrake was on. And the ignition key was broken off. Now, the headlights are still on, but the gear stick's in park and the handbrake's on. So there's a military commission of inquiry about this, and Glenn Urquhart, who is one of the police investigators also in the Farquharson case with a major collision investigation unit, he also investigated this crash.
He was the kind of like the 3 steering input guy.
Right. So he was the guy who came up with that theory about 3 steering inputs. And he's asked at the Commission of Inquiry, well, why do you think the handbrake was in, why were these things? And he says, I couldn't possibly hypothesise as to what was occurring, but from the time the vehicle was travelling to when it was recovered, an occupant within the vehicle has either deliberately or inadvertently put the handbrake on and put the gear in park. Now, in that case, obviously nobody accused anybody of foul play or murder. It was misadventure, alcohol, speed and so forth. And the soldiers were given full, honours at their funerals and so forth. So why did Farquharson turn off the lights and ignition? Why did the SAS soldiers do these things? Who knows? We just don't know. But it seems it doesn't necessarily point towards guilt.
Yeah. And obviously we can't speak to the SAS soldiers about that experience. And Farquharson, for his part, says that he can't explain why the ignition, the lights, the heater were all off. But you did get an email from someone who drove into a body of water, managed to escape, but did some pretty odd things before getting out of the car. So can you tell me about her?
Yeah, so this woman, Liz Baxter, called me, and in 1993, she's a much older woman now, but in 1993, she was at an event when the Murray River started flooding, and she got lost and drove into the river.
Okay. I can't remember exactly the date, but it would have been late September or early October. The rivers were certainly overflowing, and something didn't seem quite right, so I stopped. And I thought, that's not Goulburn Road, because there was a bit of moonlight and I could see reflection.
Mm-hmm.
But as I was thinking that, the car went down over the bank.
And as her car started sinking into the water, she remembers clearly she turned off the ignition and the headlights, and she grabbed her wallet, and she had the presence of mind, as the car's nose was going down into the water, to pop the boot on the car, which was a hatchback, and then her memory stops.
And it was strange because I became, I suppose detached is the right word, and I just turned off the lights, turned off the ignition, picked up my wallet, and that's the last thing I remember clearly until I got out of the car.
She's got no memory of climbing over to the back seat and out of the boot of the hatchback, and her memory really only comes to again when she hits the cold water. And her dominant emotion at that point is anger at herself. What an idiot that I drove into this water. But she has no memory and cannot reconstruct a memory of her journey from the front seat out of the car. But she very clearly remembers turning off the ignition and the headlights.
And does she say, did she explain why she did that?
Well, she said in her email to me, she said, I suppose it's a survival instinct. And I asked her, so she's got no memory of climbing out of the back of the car. What would it have been like if you'd have been cross-examined over those moments?
Mm.
And she basically said, I'd have been hopeless. I've got no memory. It's just a big gap there. I couldn't answer any questions about that. And you've never, over the years, or been able to recover that memory?
No, it's complete blank.
And so I sort of said, well, why do you think you did this? And she said, well...
I don't know. I think it's an automatic reaction.
Perhaps it was just automatic. That's just what you do when you get out of a car.
There were no real thoughts running through my head.
And that rang a bell with me because we'd asked the same questions of Rob Gordon. He was the trauma psychologist who's done so much work with trauma and how people react in traumatic situations. And he told me exactly the same thing, that, look, you can explain behaviours like that just by virtue of saying, well, that's kind of what you do when you get out of a car. You've done it a million times. You turn off the ignition and the lights. You wouldn't necessarily remember doing it. In the case of the SAS soldiers, perhaps you put the car in park and then, you set about trying to rescue yourself. Yeah, so that seems to be at least an innocent explanation of why those odd things might have happened.
Mm. Okay, well, let's turn to the next question. A lot of our listeners said that we didn't really address the fact that the crash happened on Father's Day, and they asked us to kind of address that coincidence because it seems like a real coincidence that it happened on Father's Day. So tell me about that, why people think that's suspicious and how that can be explained.
Yeah, so this was something that actually my colleague Katie Bice said in our conversation. We didn't include it in that final episode, but she was sort of saying, well, how do you account for the fact that it happened on Father's Day? Mm. And I've had other colleagues come up to me separately and say, well, I can all the other evidence, I can get my head around that, but I can't get past the idea that it happened on Father's Day because, how sharp it would be if your motive was revenge to commit that act on Father's Day, when every Father's Day after that, Cindy Gambino, Robert Farquharson's estranged wife, would remember that and it would torture her. And I get that, but I think there's a counter-argument to that as well. If you're separated from your wife and you've got your kids on Father's Day and you've promised them a special meal, if you're approaching that day and you're sick, you're coughing, you're not feeling well, to my mind, you're much more likely to not call in sick, essentially, on Father's Day, as you would on any other day, even an access day, because you'd push ahead with giving them their special thing. And so listeners might recall that on the way to the special meal in Geelong at the KFC, Robert Farquharson dropped in on his old mate, Michael Hart, and he asked him to come along with him.
I wasn't feeling too good. And I looked at Rob and he was not looking good. And he'd been coughing and splattering in the shed. I said, you're not well. I said, you probably shouldn't be driving. Why don't you have a barbecue here?
And Michael said to him, "Look, mate, I'm feeling a bit crook. I don't want to go. And by the way, you look terrible. You shouldn't be driving either." And Farquharson sort of pushes on anyway.
So I've already told them, and they've got their hearts, and they want to, now tell them that we're not going to Kentucky Friday. And I can relate to all that. There's no Kentucky Friday in Winchelsea. He's got to go to Geelong for it.
So, it seems to me that actually in one way makes it more likely that it would happen on a special occasion like that than on an ordinary day. By accident.
That's also because you're more likely to have an episode of cough syncope if you've been sick.
Right. If you're a kind of heavy-set middle-aged male who's a smoker or ex-smoker, that's when the experts say you're most likely to have an episode of cough syncope. And Farquharson, was not well. He'd had a throat infection and so forth. So anyway, I guess that's all to say is that you can come up with arguments either way, but to me it also opens up this broader question, and that's about probability, the likelihood of one thing happening as against something else. And this actually was a really important concept in both trials. And the prosecutors put it in slightly different ways, but it was the same idea. In the first trial, Jeremy Rapke talked about what he called the statistical improbability of this being an accident. And to explain that, he stacked up all the things that had happened sequentially and said, essentially, what are the chances of all these things happening? So it was improbable that Farquharson had had the coughing attack at that one place where there was a dam, that he'd avoided oncoming traffic, that he'd turned off the ignition and the lights, and that all this had happened to a man who 3 months earlier, on the prosecution case, had told his mate Greg King that this was going to happen on Father's Day. And according to Rapke, all that made for a really weak case that this was an accident, and a very powerful case, as he described it, of murder. In the second trial, the prosecutor really doubled down on that, and his kind of counting of all the things that had happened stacked up together went for pages and pages. How unlucky, he said, you'd have to be. What a shocking misfortune that he didn't just cough and pass out, in itself a rare event, but that it had happened in a car, and a car with his children in it when, he didn't have his children all the time, on the highway, not in a suburban street, that his foot hadn't come off the accelerator, that the dam was deep, piled on detail and detail, and finished with this flourish saying, what a dreadfully, shockingly, unbelievably unlucky man the accused was on that day if he was not a heartless murderer.
Yeah, wow.
He's got a great turn of phrase, Andrew Tinney. And in that kind of pile of things, he included the Father's Day issue. Tinney said it was significant because it was the day that would live forever in his memory and the memory of his former wife and all their families as a black and horrible day. So this was kind of added to the revenge motive. But when I was talking to Anna Maria Arabia, who's the head of the Australian Academy of Science, she'd kind of warned me about the use of statistics in courts, particularly by prosecutors. She said statistics are a really slippery concept. It's hard to get your head around them. And so, look, I thought maybe I'll talk to an expert about this.
Hello, Michael.
G'day. David, how are you?
Fine, on the dot of 9, very impressive.
And I found a guy called David Balding. He's a professor of statistical genetics at the University of Melbourne. And his interest in this stuff came up as a result of his research into DNA and basically how you get DNA evidence right in a court.
In the early days in the 1990s, when DNA profile evidence was new, even the National Academy of Sciences in the US got a panel of experts together who got it wrong, basically, because they were just not used to thinking in the sort of legal framework, and they're not used to the competing hypotheses idea.
Now, I'd kind of just assumed, well, somebody's got the DNA or they don't. It's easy. But, it's much more about how likely this DNA is to match that DNA, and it's about statistics, and courts have had to work hard to get the framing of DNA evidence right. He says they basically have.
But then when you look around, you realise that there's so much other evidence that isn't presented well in courts.
But he says the broader context of the courts is they mess up statistics all the time. And in exactly this way, he said, by piling up all the facts of a case and saying, therefore, the defendant must be guilty.
And these are the sort of cases where there's not much evidence, where people tend to go into these kind of improbability arguments, and usually in confusing ways, as I think they've done here.
And he told me this cool anecdote. It's from an American physicist called Richard Feynman, and he's giving a public lecture, and he says, when he comes into the hall and he opens up with this with the audience, he says, "The most amazing thing happened to me on the way to the lecture. I was crossing a car park and I saw a car with a number plate RUJ564. The odds against seeing that number are more than 17 million to 1, because there's, I guess, 17 million registered cars in that state or whatever." It's like, yeah, okay, that is a really tiny probability that you'd have seen that car. Also, it means nothing, right? So
because it would be like any car that you'd see is the same
probability.
Yeah.
Exactly. So damn lies and statistics. It's kind of, you can make something out of anything when it comes to stats.
Yeah.
So I sent him what the two prosecutors had said in the Robert Farquharson case, and he said he wasn't impressed with either of them. So as a statistician, what do you think of them?
I'm not impressed with either, and particularly not referencing it as luck. It's just all over the place and confusing kind of reasoning.
Because what he said was the things that happened to Farquharson, if it was an accident, were very unlikely. But it was also extremely unlikely, he said, that Farquharson was a triple murderer. Particularly somebody, as Xanthi Mallet told us, the forensic anthropologist, when there'd been no history of violence or family violence in his past. She said people just don't go from 0 to 100. So it's really, really unlikely that somebody's going to kill their 3 children.
So it's the relative probabilities of the two that really matter. The absolute values are not that interesting. And there's all kinds of unlikely things under the defence argument as well. Like, why did he suggest to his friend to come along?
Would you bother going and feeding the kids, their favourite meal at KFC? Would you buy them a cricket ball and a video at Kmart?
And why, if he was going to kill his children, would he choose such a kind of risky? Because exactly for sort of all those reasons, finding the dam in the dark and getting the right line and getting the...
You could do the same thing in the opposite direction, pile up the unlikelihoods.
So it's an incredibly unlikely scenario either way.
So according to David Balding, what prosecutors really should do is at least try to weigh up the relative odds, the unlikelihood of the innocence case as well as the unlikelihood of the guilty case, to make some kind of effort for the jury's benefit to say, well, this is an incredibly unlikely event in either scenario. So can you believe beyond reasonable doubt that it's murder?
Mm-hmm. And did you ask him about Father's Day specifically, and did he have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I did ask him about Father's Day, and actually his first natural reaction was to kind of laugh.
It's just never occurred to me that was important. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but I just...
It's like, what?
Right.
Why would that be relevant?
Yeah, right.
And I kind of explained to him why people think it's relevant, and he said, well, yeah, maybe that would change the dial a little bit. But then actually he came up with an argument similar to mine, which was, but also that's the day when you're more likely to have your children with you.
What is obvious is that he's going to have the kids on Father's Day, yes, and he doesn't have the kids every day.
So, yeah, I mean, it certainly didn't appeal to him as the kind of crushing blow that some of my colleagues think it is.
That is the sort of thing that the jury has to make a decision on. And yes, apparently there are some cases of fathers killing their children for a revenge motive. And now obviously 2 juries did find him guilty, but it's an incredibly unlikely scenario either way.
We'll be back after the break.
So the other thing that I want to talk about is the number of people who have come forward to speak to us about their own experiences with cough syncope. Obviously, in the last episode of the podcast, we spoke to Luke McMahon, to Farquharson's lawyer, who told us that, he was putting together a long list, a table of people who'd come forward and said, what happened to Farquharson has happened to me. I've had an episode of cough syncope before. But I think, we've also had a lot of people come forward to us, a surprising amount.
Yeah, I mean, that surprised me as well because, I guess everything in this case, certainly from the prosecution side, points to cough syncope, coughing and passing out, being an incredibly rare event. But all these people have kind of come out of the woodwork. And I had a colleague approach me shortly after the podcast started coming out saying, look, that happens to me. I've never passed out, but I get really dizzy and disoriented, and I won't drive if I've got a cold or a chest infection. And then we got these emails. There's a woman who told me that her husband, 6'4", smoker, stood up one night, coughed, and face planted onto the floor and got 8 stitches in his chin. But to me, the most remarkable was one guy who called Robert Campbell, who did approach Luke, and I got his number, and I gave him a call. And what prompted me to do that is that his story is so similar to Robert Farquharson's. Can you tell me what happened to you and when?
So this was probably 2 years ago, I think.
He's a middle-aged smoker, and he was driving back to Victoria from South Australia, and he was drinking a takeaway coffee, and he was joking around with his son in the car.
Hello?
Oh, good day. Is that Spencer?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Michael Bachelard here. So, I spoke to your dad earlier today just about his experience. And they were in the car driving along and sipping the coffee, and he inhaled a bit of his coffee.
And he started coughing. But I thought, because I was in the passenger seat, that it was a bit of a joke because he likes to joke around in the car.
And then he keeps coughing and can't get any breath in, and his son thinks he's joking around.
And I didn't realise till he started passing out and steering us off the road that it wasn't a joke.
But he passes out.
The way I describe it is I had the coffee, went down the wrong hole. I was trying to catch my breath and breathe in while I was doing, my body was forcing me to cough, and I faded away to nothing.
And just like Farquharson, the car goes across the oncoming lane of traffic, off the road, down an embankment, through a fence, and off into a paddock. And I've seen the photos of the car's trajectory through that paddock, and it's this kind of rightward curve. And do you know how the car sort of started initially drifting off the road?
It was just a slow turn. I think it was just from his steering, because he was drinking his coffee and steering at the same time. So when he started choking, I think he still had that hand on the steering wheel. So as he was coughing, he was just slowly turning it until we were just facing, to the right, going off.
I see, but he was definitely unconscious by that point.
Yeah.
And not deliberately steering, it was just...
No, I think it was just a reflex or something, or his hand was just stuck on it.
And ultimately the only... there was all stuff in Farquharson's case, the prosecutor saying, well, how unlucky it was that his foot hadn't just come off the accelerator, how he remained under acceleration, how the steering had gone this way, how he'd avoided the tree and so forth. But in this case, in Campbell's case, the foot stayed on the accelerator, the car veered off to the right. Ultimately, the only way they managed to stop the car was Spencer, his son, grabbed the wheel. He put the car in neutral.
Put the car into neutral and then, put the handbrake on to slow us down.
Wow. That must have been terrifying.
Yes, it was.
They pulled Dad, Robert, out of the driver's seat and described him as being still disoriented, and he only woke up when they dragged him out of the driver's seat.
Olga, my partner, was reaching over and sort of trying to shake me, and Spencer, my son, was in the left-hand front seat and trying to wake me up and all that. And it was a total shock. I couldn't believe what had happened.
Didn't know where he was, how he got there, obviously very confused. The similarities, if Farquharson's innocent, really are uncanny.
And did you speak to him about the Farquharson case and what he thought about that, and if this is, if that changed his mind, if he knew about the case beforehand?
Yeah, so he had known about the case, and he'd kind of just made the assumption that, that like so many people do, that Farquharson was guilty and had done it deliberately.
I didn't look into the technical side of it or the science side of it or the forensics, or I didn't spend that much time on it. I just thought, yes, there's another person, family violence, killed his kids, what a horrible thing.
And he really didn't put two and two together until he listened to our podcast and read the story, that he'd had cough syncope. Nobody had ever diagnosed him with cough syncope.
Oh, wow.
He went off to hospital, he had all these tests, but they were looking for heart attack. And it was only when he read the article and he heard about cough syncope for the first time that he just went, my God, that's me. That's what
Yeah.
happened to me.
Just thought, Jesus, that's true. That does happen to people, and that may well be rare, but it seems to me that it happened to me and it happened to him.
He said, I 100% changed my view of Farquharson. It's a thing. It really happens.
Mm.
And that all got me thinking. The number of people who'd contacted me got me thinking, well, if it's like happened to all these people, how could the prosecution's expert in both trials, a guy called Professor Matthew Norton, how could he argue that it was extremely unlikely? And that reminded me of something that also didn't make the podcast, but I think is really important, that before Professor Norton gave his expert evidence on the serious unlikelihood that Robert Farquharson had cough syncope, the prosecution had sent him a pile of documents, 25 different documents. He had everything. He had Farquharson's police interview. He had the statement of Stephen Moores, who was Cindy Gambino's second partner. He had the traffic reconstruction evidence. Now, only a tiny proportion of these things were relevant to what was being asked of him, which was an expert advice on cough syncope. And I spoke to Emma Cunliffe about this. You might remember she's an academic who knows all about tunnel vision, and she's kind of an expert in experts and their evidence in courts. And I asked her, was it appropriate that he should have been sent all these things? And her response was absolutely unequivocal. Is that appropriate?
No. Sorry, I can be that categorical.
She said, experts just shouldn't be given that stuff.
All that should be shared with an expert witness is the minimum amount of information that is necessary to allow the expert witness to offer the opinion that is within their sphere of expertise.
She said they're human like the rest of us, and they can be swayed by this kind of what she called contextually biasing information. They are susceptible to being biased. It's potentially prejudicial. In your view, if somebody has been provided with all those things, should that actually rule them out of being an expert witness?
Yes, in my view, in circumstances where the expert witness has been exposed to unnecessary information that has the potential to affect their opinion, the only solution is to refuse to admit that expert's opinion and to require that the proper process be followed with an alternative expert.
So I've got to be really candid here. We're not saying that Professor Norton was biased by these things.
Mm.
We don't know. We've asked him for interviews and I've asked him this specific question and he doesn't want to talk to us and he hasn't answered those questions. But all I'm saying is that he was sent this stuff and that, according to Emma Cunliffe, he just shouldn't have been.
Mm. So are there any rules or anything about what actually you're able to kind of hand over to expert witnesses? I'm surprised to hear that you can kind of just hand over basically the whole brief of evidence.
Well, so was I, Ruby, when I heard that. So I went to the Office of Public Prosecutions in Victoria and I asked them, what are the rules? Tell me what the rules were in 2007 for the first trial and tell me the rules now. And can you tell me if there's anything changed, given all this research now into prejudice and bias and that kind of thing? They initially refused to answer the question and I kind of said, look, all I want is the rules. And they came back to me and said there aren't any. It's done on a case-by-case basis. So to me that suggests that an individual prosecutor who's running a case to try and convict a suspected person can give their experts whatever they want on a case-by-case basis, even if it's potentially prejudicial. And in Victoria, at least, there are no rules to govern that. I find that astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, me too. Okay, well, let's turn to the final thing that we want to chat about today. This hasn't really been raised explicitly by a listener, but it's something that we've thought about a lot and we couldn't fit it into the podcast. I think it's a really interesting part of the case that goes to Farquharson's demeanour on the night of the crash, which is something that a lot of people have written to us about. And it's all about whether he refused offers to call 000 on the night. So tell me about that. What happened?
Yeah, so this is really kind of complicated and knotty sort of an issue, but it is important for some people. And it was raised by our colleague Kate Leahy when we interviewed her in episode 5, when she said it was one of the things about Farquharson's behaviour on the night that she just couldn't get past. She said he refused to call 000. But reading through all the evidence as it changed over time, it's much more complicated and less clear than that. And the question really is, was he ever offered a phone to make that call? His phone was at the bottom of the dam. Was he ever offered a phone, and did he refuse it? So bear with me here because it kind of gets a bit knotty. So 2 guys picked him up on the side of the road, Shane Atkinson and Tony McClelland. And the basis of the accusation that he refused to call 000 was that they offered him a phone and that he said, no, just take me to Cindy's. But their evidence changed on this. So in his first statement, which was made the night after the crash, so the Monday night, Shane Atkinson seems to suggest that he had a phone with him. He says they did all this driving around, they were feeding dogs and that kind of thing, and that at one point he checked his phone and the time was 7:22 p.m. So it suggests that he had a phone with him. But then in that first statement, he says nothing about offering it to Farquharson. He did say, you've got to call the police, and that Farquharson said, just take me to Cindy, but he never says I offered him my phone to do that. And in fact, even more powerful than that, they didn't even think to use that phone themselves. So after they dropped Farquharson at Cindy's house, they drive, McClelland and Atkinson drive to the local police station and they bang on the door, but it's locked, it's closed. And then they go to the police sergeant's house next door and they bang on that door trying to rouse the police sergeant. They still haven't used their own phone. And then all this kerfuffle is causing all this noise, and all these people, these neighbours come out on the street, and a bloke from across the road comes out and he says, this is Atkinson saying, he says I could use his phone, and that bloke called 000 for me and I asked for an ambulance. So the first time Atkinson calls 000, it's on somebody else's phone.
Yes. And you would think if he had a phone with him at that time, he would have whipped it out and made the call himself.
Right. You would have thought that.
Yeah.
But at the committal hearing, so a committal hearing is kind of like a pre-hearing, just so the prosecution and the defence can test their arguments and so forth. So at the committal hearing, Atkinson gives evidence and he says he had a phone with him, but he wasn't asked at the committal whether he'd offered it to Farquharson or not. But by the time of the first trial, 2 years later, in 2007, that's changed. He says, I am positive that I did give Farquharson my phone on a number of occasions. Now, Tony McClelland, who's in the car with him, he's got no memory of a phone being offered in his original police statement. His statement says the first mention of calling the police came when they got to Cindy's house, and he says, me and Shane then told Cindy to ring the ambos and the cops. In the committal and the first trial, Tony McClelland was asked and was very clear on this, says he's got no memory of Farquharson ever being offered a phone. But come the second trial, that changes, and McClelland says for the first time that there was a phone and that it was offered to Farquharson. Mm-hmm. So the second trial's in 2010, 5 years after the events. But he couldn't give any details about that offer. So to me, I don't think you can so clearly say that he refused the offer of a phone.
Yeah, which was all kind of a big part of the demeanour argument, wasn't it? Where it's kind of like, well, you know, if you really wanted to help, if you really hadn't done this, the normal thing to do would be to call 000, or at least not refuse offers from other people to call 000.
Right, exactly. And it just seems inexplicable to me that if they had a phone, that's Atkinson and McClelland, that they themselves would have used it or dialed 000 and handed it to Farquharson, and that they wouldn't have gone banging on the door of the police station, which they'd been told was locked, and then trying to rouse the sergeant who wasn't there, and then getting some guy from across the road to dial 000 for them. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And so I think that idea that Kate put out, and that, you know, the prosecutor and ultimately the judge also put out, that Robert Farquharson had refused the offer of a phone, I just don't think you can say that with that level of clarity, given the number of changes in the evidence over time. I certainly wouldn't say that you could, on that particular point, which some people find very important, that you could say beyond reasonable doubt that that's something he did or failed to do. Now, I'd like to talk to Shane Atkinson about this and Tony McClelland, but Tony's refused to talk to us, and Shane unfortunately died a few years ago. But what I'd be asking them is, well, what happened between there and there and there for that evidence to change?
Yeah, it's quite a complicated point, but I think it's also a really interesting one. That's it for now in terms of the questions that we wanted to answer in this episode. But if you're listening to this and you have any other questions that you want answered, you should write to us because we'll do more bonus episodes over the coming months.
Yeah, write to me, mbachelard@theage.com.au. That's mbachelard@theage.com.au. And we'll be following the case as it goes to the Court of Appeal later this year too. Trial by Water is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. It's hosted and reported by me, Michael Bachelard. It's produced by Ruby Schwartz. She's also the head of investigative podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to rate and review the podcast and recommend it to your friends. When there's something to update you on, we'll keep you posted with bonus episodes. Meanwhile, subscribe to The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald to read more. Thanks for listening.